This video will demonstrate a still life process. Before I go over any techniques, I just want to start with some stuff about compositions. So we want to make sure that we have a good composition to start with. You want to pick out some objects. Hopefully you can find some objects that have an interesting relationship or theme. I'm kind of working with like a cooking theme here. But this picture right here is not an example of a strong composition. It's just stuff on a table, right? So how do we arrange it in a way to make it interesting? Now this is getting much closer. You can start thinking about the principles of design to help you organize the image. A really easy place to start is the rule of thirds. Here you can see how the objects are lined up on the intersection of those grid lines. You'll want to think about balance, the distribution of visual weight. It can help to think about unity or rhythm. So here I'm pointing at how a similar color is showing up on either side of the axis, as well as the organic form. And then here the horizontal highlight from the reflective surface is also showing up on either side of the axis. And then another thing to consider is movement. And so you can follow the lines of action and they kind of lead your eye around the piece and make it a little bit more of an interesting composition. So I'm going to do a drawing of that, and then I'm going to transfer that drawing to a tone background that I'm going to paint on top of. Then I flip my drawing over, and then I cover the back of it with a vine charcoal. I want to make sure that the surface that I'm working on top of is nice and clean and there's no bumps or whatever that's gonna push through to the surface of the paper. And then I'm just gonna go back and forth and get a nice buildup of material. I want a buildup of dust that's gonna easily transfer to a different surface. And there's gonna be a little bit of excess on it, so I'll just shake that off and try to limit my mess. And I'm gonna try to touch it as little as possible too, because wherever I touch it, it's gonna push off onto the surface. So I'm kind of just floating it up in front of the painting paper, making sure that it's square and flat, and because I don't want it to be crooked, obviously. And my painting paper is already taped down, and now I'm just going to go through and tape my drawing to it, to, like I said, to make sure that I touch it as little as possible. So you notice my fingers kind of on the very bottom of it, and I'm just going through and looking for lines. I'm tracing all the contour lines, and I'm also tracing the terminator lines, just the major lines that are going to help me separate the lights from the darks. If I take that off, the dust is gonna be pretty easy to move, so I want to spray it with a fixative. I'm just gonna use a workable fixative. You could potentially use hairspray if you don't have that. You will want to make sure that you have some sort of ventilation because it's pretty strong smelling. And I'll want to let that sit for a little bit and dry. And then I'm ready for my first pass of painting, the block-in stage. I'm using a monochromatic color scheme, so I just have white, black, and like that crimson color. I'm blocking in just a couple values right now. I'm starting with the darkest values. So I'm finding the core shadow and the terminator line. I transferred that terminator line from my drawing. You can see I just went over it, so that's pretty easy to find. And then I'm just gonna keep going. I'm focusing on just the darkest areas right now. For the reflected light area, where it's a little bit lighter, you can see I thinned my paint, so a little bit of the tone background is showing through. And that will help me make sure I don't lose track of my reflected light. If I'm done with my shadows, I can move on to my midtones. And a helpful way to think about this block-in stage is just thinking about it in terms of three values: your darks, your mids, and your lights. So I'm done with my threes, I'm on to my twos, my midtones. I'm using mostly just the color. I'm not using much black, I'm not using any white, just using the color to get those middle values. And then for the center light and the highlight, I will use white. There's a couple different ways you could do this. I could potentially lay it down as flat values. I'm doing a little bit more blending right now. It's really rough. I'm not worrying about being precise at all. The main point of this stage is just to clearly organize your values, clearly organize and separate your light planes and your dark planes. And then a helpful kind of tip here is to try to finish with your light planes. Try to finish with bringing the light areas over the dark areas, because that will help your illusion quite a bit. I'll just go through and do this, that same process on the rest of these items real quick. I have it fast forwarded here, but it's essentially the same. I'm going to continue to organize my values into those three basic categories. My darkest areas, my core shadows, are that 3 value. My midtones are my 2 value. And then my center light and my highlight are my 1 value. After my block in, I'm going to start with the second pass of refining my values. I'm specifically working with tints right now. I'm going from white to that main color, and I want to do that to try to stay organized. I don't want to jump back and forth between different planes, go from light areas to shadows. Doing this will help me stay organized, and it will give me a lot more control over my values, and that's obviously going to be helpful. Then for this next step, you could call it rolling the form. I'm basically just going through a value scale directly on the surface of the object. Having lights and darks is going to start to communicate a three-dimensional form. But then going through these smooth transitions will help communicate a rounded surface. And so that's really important. If my transitions are too quick, too dramatic, then it's going to kind of look like an angle. So I want to make sure that I'm going through the value scale with these kind of little incremental steps. At this stage, I'm starting to refine, so I'm also starting to think about the direction of my brush marks. By going a particular direction, it's going to start to communicate a texture on the surface. Now I'm going to transition to my shades. And so it's basically the same process. I'm using black and that main color. Now I'm going to go through the dark half of the value scale. So obviously my core shadow and cast shadow and those areas are going to be really dark, but now is when I need to consider the reflected light. And this is a really important part of creating a convincing illusion, no matter what your object is, really. You can see I'm bringing in the color, and that's really important, that it's the color and not a tint, because a tint is going to be too light. Remember, tints belong in the light planes. The reflected light is a shadow plane, so even though it might look really bright, you have to try to keep it darker than the light areas. All right, my final pass here. I'm starting to worry about details a little bit more, about surface texture a little bit more. I'm going to show you a couple ways to do that without getting caught up in trying to illustrate them. I'm not trying to outline these details. I'll allow my brush to do as much work as I can. Dry brush can be an effective way to do this. I have a very small amount of paint in the end of my brush. I'm dragging it across the surface, and you'll get some of the texture from the brush. Also, the texture from the paint will pick up areas. I'm going to use a thick amount of paint, impasto, for the highlighted areas, and that will help the illusion of bringing the light plane forward. That was, if you think back a little bit ago, how I talked about trying to finish with the light areas. That's along the same lines as that idea. The light areas are on top of the dark areas. Here's another example of letting the brush do the work when you can. The texture of the brush is starting to communicate that look of brushed steel. I'm using an impasto for a cork texture. And those 3 areas, I got a wide variety of textures just by using different approaches with the brush. And there's really no end to ways that you can do that. And different objects are going to require different approaches, and that's probably going to take some experimentation to figure out. But that's okay. That's the fun part. All right, I'm jumping back down to these peppers here. These are difficult form. They're really twisted up, and so there's a lot of information to take in. For something like this, it can be very helpful to think about the planes and the plane's relationship to the light source. And I'm really letting that guide my observations right now, just thinking about the direction that these planes of the pepper are facing. I'm just finishing this up, I guess, with a little bit of a background. And there's no right or wrong way to do this. I'm just doing a gray background. I'm letting some small pieces of the tone paper show through, but just kind of taking a straightforward approach of finishing the three-dimensional space to kind of ground my still life. And there you go. There is a pretty basic approach to monochromatic still life. Now, there's obviously lots of room to expand on this. You could keep tinkering with this and refine this as much as you wanted, but that is an introduction to the process at least. So good luck, guys, and I hope this was helpful.